Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts this morning be pleasing to you, our Lord, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. I hope you keep in mind Debbie's children's sermon about making the roads in our hearts and our minds straight as we walk through this passage from the book of Revelation, because I think it's all about that. But to start, let me just tell you that I've never been to court, which you should probably be happy about as somebody who employs me. I've never been to court. The closest I got was paying a speeding ticket at the window outside the courtroom, but I did that actually to avoid going in there. And yes, I was completely guilty of that. Just ask Emma, she was in the car. And for like 3 years afterwards, she would always tell me, "Are you speeding? Are you speeding? Are you speeding?" There you go. If you want to feel guilt, just, get a policeman to come to your window while your daughter's in the back. All right. So I have to be honest, though, that the only real, personal, real-life context I have to make sense of the greatest court scene in the history of the universe here in Revelation 20, the only real-life context I have is TV shows. That's all I got. I have TV shows. And quite frankly, I'm not sure how much Perry Mason is going to help us out here at the end of Revelation 20, verses 11 through 15, but we'll see how it goes. Then I saw a great white throne and the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also, another book was opened, the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Last week, we saw the epic collapse in Revelation 17 and 18 of the Whore of Babylon. It's this vivid image for everything that distracts us, everything that distances us from God. It's all those wayward passions of ours, all those emotions and fears and worries and anxieties and desires, everything that pulls at us, makes us sweat a little bit. The Whore of Babylon isn't sin itself, but those things, even truly good things, that push us down roads that don't lead to God. In other words, the Whore of Babylon is idolatry, adulterous idolatry. But all that's done now. In chapter 18, we saw the fall of the great whore. Today, chapters 19 and 20 take that fall one step further. They tell the story of the end of absolutely everything. The beast and the false prophet that we've seen, the dragon, they're all gone. Satan, all of his minions, gone. We even get a glimpse of what's supposed to be the greatest celebration of our lives, of the victory of God, the wedding feast of the Lamb, we're told. At that dinner, we're told that God and all of God's people finally become one. They finally find peace. But then something else happens. Almost out of nowhere, we find ourselves transported to a courtroom. Everyone on the planet who has ever lived, absolutely everyone, great and small, rich and poor, Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter who you are, if you lived, you're here, standing in that courtroom. But there are no lawyers. There's only one judge. There's no defense counsel. There's the judge and two books. And those books, we are told, are open. John's borrowing from what to him would have been a famous passage from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, chapter 7, which says, As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. And the court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. John's pulling from this. Revelation gives us actually the name of one of those books that's open. John calls it the Book of Life. We've heard of this book actually before. In Revelation chapter 3, Jesus tells the 7 churches, he says, if you conquer, you will be clothed like them in white robes, and I will not blot your name out of the book of life. Same thing comes up again in chapters 13 and 17, though this time in these two places, the book of life is said to be that way of distinguishing between those who worship the beast on one hand and those who worship the slaughtered lamb. The ones who do worship the slaughtered lamb are in the book of life. So the real question here in Revelation 20 is, what do we make of that other book? That other book. What is it? Is it a book of works? Sounds like it. Listen again to verse 12. And the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And all were judged according to what they had done. To me, this sounds like at the end of time, at the end of everything, everybody who's ever lived is going to be judged according to what we've done in our lives, according to our works. This is that part where I said you're going to hear a little bit about Christmas at my house. We've got this thing going on at my house called the Elf on a Shelf. Y'all know Elf on a Shelf? Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about it in case familiarize. All right, you have this stuffed little elf, all right, that I don't think my kids aren't here, right? You purchase it from Target, okay? It comes with a book. Huh? I don't know what she's saying. Okay, you get it from Target. It comes with a book, right? It's totally real if you're my kids. Emma has been wanting one of these for like 3 years. All of her friends at school have it. And so this little elf is supposed to sit, as you might guess, on a shelf in your house. Really, the guy can sit anywhere in your house. And what he does, and the book tells you this, what he does is he watches. He pays attention. If you're being good little boys and good little girls, he's watching, and at night, when you fall asleep, he scoots back up to the North Pole, using magic, of course, and he tells Santa how you've been that day. He tells Santa. And then he comes back, and this is the really fun part of this whole elf on a shelf thing. He comes back in the morning, and he's always in a different place. And so the kids, my kids especially, love to wake up, and the first thing they want to do is they want to go find the elf, right? And sometimes we're like, oh no, we put the elf in the other kid's room, and she's not awake yet. And so Marty can be a little loud. But anyways, they have a whole lot of fun playing hide and seek with the elf early on in the morning. There's a whole moral to this game, of course. You probably already figured it out. If you do something bad, you better watch out because the elf is watching. And Santa's he's gonna know. It sounds a little bit like a song I heard when I was a kid. I've sung this actually before to you. I actually think this song was based off of Revelation 20 and this great white throne judgment that we're reading about. It goes something like this. Oh, be careful, little child, what you say. Oh, be careful, little child, what you say. For the Father up above is looking down in love. Oh, be careful, little child, what you say. Because if you say something bad, he's going to get you, right? That's the whole moral. Why do we do this? Why? Oh, by the way, when we got this Elf on the Shelf, Emma really, really wanted it. And I read it, I'm like, oh gosh, we're teaching bad theology. Okay. Why do we think this way? You know how many times I've had to lie to my kids over the past week with this thing? Oh, I don't know. The elf came, and there it goes. Who knows where he went? I know. I put him over there. Okay. Sarah told me I had to remove all of this sort of stuff if Emma was actually in the room, but she's not. So you get to hear all my backdoor thinking. My guess is, though, the reason why we do these things, like this song and this Elf on the Shelf, and why we have this feeling that if we do something bad, it's going to come back to haunt us, is we have that unshakable fear that that's how justice works. We call it karma in some places. It doesn't really matter what you want to call it. It could be Santa, it could be God, but our fear is that we're going to get what's coming to us, right? It might not be until the very end, but we're going to get it. And that's justice. We want it. We want it especially for other people, but we want it. And so that's how we usually interpret the great courtroom scene at the end of Revelation in chapter 20. Jesus is sitting up there, high and mighty on his throne. Two books open before him, the book of life and the book of our works. And we're all going to be judged according to it. It's frightening. There's only one problem. This logic seems to go straight up against a little thing we call the gospel. Amen. Yep. For by grace you've been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Amen. So is Revelation 20 reversing the gospel? I don't think so. I'll tell you a story. It's one I heard from none other than Tom Gardner. So we're going to have like this tag team preaching from the front and back of the sanctuary right now. I believe actually Tom gave it in a sermon once, standing right here, but it's so good and so worth retelling, especially in this context, and I'm going to tell it to you again. It goes like this. It was a cold, wintry January night in the middle of the Great Depression. Times were tough, but they were tougher in New York City. They were tougher in New York City. And Mayor LaGuardia at the time, the LaGuardia International Airport LaGuardia, turns up at one of New York's night courts. Turns up at one of these courts, and it happens to be the court that's serving the most poverty-stricken part of New York. All right? LaGuardia walks in. He walks in and he dismisses the judge who's sitting there. He gives him a break for the night. Apparently, if you're mayor back then, you could do that. Sounds pretty cool. So he just gives the guy a night off. All right, he says, "Go. I'll handle it from here." Well, up on the docket was an old woman. First case come before him. An old woman who lived with her daughter and her grandkids. Her daughter was at home sick. All right, her daughter was single. Her husband had left her stranded, and the grandkids and everybody else in the house really were starving. Here in Western society, we tend to think, we have a tradition of granting clemency to folks who do minor thefts of food and other things in order to survive. All right, we think that, there comes a point to where if you have to steal to survive to feed your kids, that may be okay. We have this sort of ethic, but the particular shopkeeper who she stole from, a loaf of bread, wasn't having any of it. He said this old woman needed to pay. She needed to be punished because she needed to be used to teach the neighborhood a lesson. And that lesson was simple: don't steal. Don't steal. As the story goes, LaGuardia heard this. He heard this from the store owner, and he sighed. He admitted to the court that there's no exception to the law. If the shopkeeper doesn't drop the charges, he has to charge her. So the old lady had to be punished. And LaGuardia, what's he do? But he opens up the books, and he reads them. $10 or 10 days in jail. That's the punishment. And LaGuardia decides, your fine, ma'am, is $10. Obviously, she doesn't have this, and he knows it. But at the very moment the gavel comes down, he's already reaching into his pocket, and he pulls out a $10 bill, and he pays the cost right for her. That's the gospel, right? The righteous judge takes her punishment. The righteous judge has mercy and grace. So here's my question. Why does Fiorello LaGuardia sound more like Jesus than Jesus himself does in Revelation chapter 20? I wonder if it might be because we all like the idea that people will one day get what's coming to them. Justice, we think deep down, has to be served. And I don't know, who said it has to be served cold? Somebody did, right? The thing is, we just don't think LaGuardia's old woman did anything all that wrong, and so we're taken aback by the storekeeper, right? But if you would, let's just take one step back ourselves and ask a question. Where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line between what is forgivable and what isn't? Where do we draw the line of what merits retribution and what doesn't? Let me ask you, if that little old lady had broken a window, would that be worth it? What if she had come in and pointed a gun at the store owner? Would that change things? What if she, God forbid, shot him? Does that change? This woman was starving. It was literally a life or death situation. She was protecting her family. You might even call it self-defense. She was afraid she was going to die, and her daughter and her grandkids were going to die right with her if she did not get that loaf of bread. A fear like that can drive anyone to do terrible things. Justice, if you get right down to it, is not so easy to figure out, much less to dole out. So maybe it's a good thing we're not judges of the universe sitting up there with the books wide open. But we know who is. And all throughout the book of Revelation, there's only one person who has ever said to dispense justice against sin and death and evil. It's not us. It's not the people written with their names written in the book of life. It's just the Lamb. Only the Lamb, only Jesus. And he only does it through the shedding of his own blood. Well, that's Mayor LaGuardia. That's mercy. This is what we saw at the end of the seven seals all throughout Revelation. It's what we saw at the end of the seven trumpets. This is what we saw at the end of the seven bowls with their seven plagues. Revelation is not a story of you better watch out because God's a-coming. It's a story of how the slaughtered lamb is literally bleeding out for the world. The whole entire world, with no exceptions. John continually tells us all nations and tongues and languages and people are going to come before God. Everyone. Why would all of this change the moment we get to the end of chapter 20? The answer is, of course, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. But this doesn't mean there's not justice. It just means that what we find here is a justice that we don't tend to think about. The other day I heard this. What greater revenge, it's a couple lines. What greater revenge is there against violence than peace? What greater revenge is there against death than life? If you want revenge against violence, you can't get it with more violence. If you want revenge against death, you can't feed it. You only have one option. It's life. So what in that great white throne room does God actually want? What is he hoping to accomplish? In Luke chapter 8, Jesus tells this little parable about a lamp and a jar. He says, no one, after lighting a lamp, hides it under a jar or puts it under a bed, but the person puts it on a lampstand so that those who enter may see the light. For nothing is hidden, Jesus says, that will not be disclosed, nor is anything secret that will not become known and come to light. The books, Jesus says, are opened. It's all there. All our wayward thoughts, all our desires, all our actions that we've taken to go along with them, it's all there, laid bare. And what happens is we see how we've been doing it wrongly the whole time. We tend to think that sin and evil happen mostly because people are consciously acting against God, all right? They're consciously, intentionally moving against God's ways. We think there are just some folks out there who want to be evil, that just want to see the world burn. It's hard to think that maybe what we have are a bunch of broken people who really need healing, who need Jesus. It's just easier to think that they're the devil. In reality, though, I don't think that's how things work. It's not the picture we get in Scripture. It's not the picture Jesus gives it. It's not the picture we get in the book of Revelation. Why do we sin? Why do we do terrible things? Because we think it's the best option we got. That's how death rules our lives. Even if what we do isn't necessarily good for others, we believe, at least in the moment, it's good for us. It's good for us. We do it because we think it's good for us. We're always seeking after things we think are good, things like life, things like escape, things like release, comfort, joy. But how we seek these things and where we seek them is not always good. What greater revenge is there against violence than peace? What greater revenge is there against death than life? In other words, greatest revenge is not violence. Death's greatest revenge is not death. It's peace and it's life. What happens is what happens in that great cosmic courtroom of God is we finally get to see clearly through the eyes of Jesus, through the blood of the slaughtered lamb. After all, remember, he's the only one there, him and us. There's no lawyers. There's no defense for us. We're guilty. It's obvious. And that's terrifying. I mean, just imagine. Can you imagine what it'd be like to run in one direction your whole life, or even parts of your life, thinking, that's the right direction? You bet your whole life on it. This is the way to go. Only to realize when you come to the end, I was wrong. I was wrong. Can you imagine the regret? Jim Marshall famously recovered a fumble against the San Francisco 49ers and ran it 66 yards for a touchdown. Except it wasn't a touchdown. He was so excited, he threw the ball into the stands when he got there, only to realize that he ran the wrong direction. And it was a safety for the other team. A few years ago, I did some research on how the families and friends of murder victims felt after watching the person who killed their loved one die through lethal injection. They sat there behind a big bay window and watched as their dads or mothers or sons or daughters' murderer died on a gurney. And I just wanted to know, it wasn't an issue about, should capital punishment be allowed or not. I just wanted to know if it worked. I wanted to know, did they find closure in it? I wanted to know, did they find healing? Was it healing to them to know that the person who ripped their loved one away from them was now punished, was now dead too? And most of them, this was what was surprising, most of them said no. They said no, it didn't take away the pain. Some said they felt justice had been done, and they thought that was a good thing, but they rarely said that they felt good about it. Justice didn't bring their loved ones back, after all. That pain was still there. The anger was still there. The only thing that in the end actually helped when you asked folks is when they came to the point where they told themselves, I realized I'd forgiven that person, the killer. It's when they forgave. They had to forgive the person who murdered their loved one, and that helped. That brought peace. It reminds me of this line of Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do, which he says hanging there on the cross. Or let the person who is without sin cast the first stone. He says in John 8, as he's confronted with someone who's been caught in the very act of adultery. Do you remember the story? Do you remember what happens after that? Nobody throws even a single stone. They just walk away. Jesus doesn't even throw a stone. Instead, he tells her to go and sin no more. He doesn't just let her go. He says, go and sin no more. That's God's justice. What happens in that great courtroom at the end of time? What happens? We come before Jesus with all our works laid bare, laid out before us, but it's not to embarrass us. It's not to dredge up the past so that God can sneer at us, so that he can sit all high and mighty on that throne and say, I'm so good because you're so bad. That's not Jesus. It's not to embarrass or to demean us. It's simply to change us. It's always been about change. about holiness, about becoming like Jesus and the Lamb. What is that book next to the book of life? It's not the book of works. It's the book of death. And what we're being asked here at Revelation 20, at the end, in the final courtroom, is which book has my name in it? Is it the book of death or the book of life? Which way am I following? Which path? Today in Advent is the day we traditionally, as we heard earlier, celebrate peace, a coming peace. And Emma read one of the most famous passages about peace during that candlelighting ceremony. It was a prophecy about John the Baptist. And it ends like this: "And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people by the forgiveness of their sins. By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness, in the shadow of death, us, to guide our feet to the path of peace." Luke 1, 76 through 79. The great white throne judgment room, the court room at the end of Revelation 20, it's the fulfillment of this Advent promise. We are the ones sitting in darkness, in the shadow of death, waiting for that brilliant peace. We see glimpses of it today, but the shadow of death always lingers, always threatening, always tempting us to run the other direction, to seek life in our own way. "Wretched man that I am," Paul says in Romans chapter 7, "who will rescue me from this body of death?" Of death. The Lamb at the great white throne, finally at last, will rescue us. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire, John says. It's the second death, the death of death. That's our peace. That's our peace, our promised peace at the end. Amen.